We will, in this program, be giving you little reminders of the timeline, how we got into that war. And it's really started, well, it started in 1993, I suppose, when Saddam Hussein tried to assassinate the first President Bush, or perhaps it started in 1992 when then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney said President Bush Sr. was wise not to invade Iraq, and then laid out all the exact bad things that were to happen later when we did invade Iraq. But the invasion began in earnest, nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, certainly nothing to do with 9/11. It began in 1998 when, among other things, the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC, a group founded by people that included Dick Cheney, Scooter Libby, Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, Paul Wolfowitz, the whole neocon gang, got together and demanded that then President Clinton undertake the quote-unquote removal of Saddam Hussein's regime, the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime. That is your reminder that these people were at it for years before they finally found the excuse they needed to take us to war in Iraq. Why did they take us to war in Iraq? Well, Dick Cheney, who by then was president of Halliburton, also said in 1998, and I quote Mr. Cheney, "The good Lord didn't see fit to put oil and gas only where there are democratically elected regimes friendly to the United States." Why don't we jump to late that same year of 1998 when General Anthony Zinni, who was then head of U.S. Central Command, met with or examined the plans of Iraqi exile Ahmed Chalabi, whose name would come up again in the timeline of the American invasion of Iraq. Chalabi claimed to have a military plan to overthrow Saddam Hussein with 1,000 men. He wanted the support of the United States. General Zinni warned Congress that Chalabi's plan was, quote, pie in the sky, a fairy tale, end quote. Nevertheless, a defector from Iraq connected with Chalabi, codenamed Curveball, remember that name, who, by the way, was a convicted sex offender and a low-level person in the engineering world, became the sole source for much of the case that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. Now, isn't it funny that this marginal character connected to another marginal character with grandiose plans of wanting the United States support was the sole source for a story that eventually made its way into the New York Times and became a key part of our argument for war. German intelligence officers described Curveball's information as highly suspect. U.S. agents never debriefed him. They never performed a background check on him. And yet the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency passed his quote-unquote intel onto senior policymakers. It's insane. We'll continue to talk about the timeline of how we got into the war in Iraq, and to do this I've relied in large part on some work done by Jonathan Stein and Tim Dickinson for Mother Jones. They did good work. I pulled that together with some other sources, but I want to thank and credit them. Now, I want to remind you that we now know that the removal of Saddam Hussein was considered the top item, described as the top item in Bush's very first national security meeting, which took place on January 30th, 2001. And yet the excuses we were given for invading Iraq were largely based on the attack which took place some 8 months later on September 11th of that year. So that is a timeline. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill recalled later the quote, "It was all about finding a way to do it," meaning invade Iraq. The president saying, "Go find me a way to do this." So, in other words, Bush, the liar, was actually planning to do this for a long time. And I pointedly call Bush a liar, one, because he is, and secondly, because among those trying to rewrite history is his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, who was all over Twitter this past week saying, I don't want people going around anymore saying Bush lied, people died. That's just not fair. Well, Bush lied, people died, and this timeline shows it. Now, in February of that year, February 11th, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld told Fox News's Tony Snow, quote, Iraq is probably not a nuclear threat at the present time. A couple days later, still in February, Dick Cheney's Energy Task Force began to conduct secret meetings with oil company executives. Now, on February 16th, U.S. and British forces started bombing targets near Baghdad. Why? According to Bush, quote, to send a clear signal to Saddam. Secretary of State Colin Powell reported to the public on February 24th that Saddam, quote, has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. Now, an entire monologue, a long one, could be focused on how Colin Powell, contrary to his reputation, actually participated in misleading the public, but we won't take that sidetrack for now. Instead, we will say that this timeline shows long premeditation in the Iraq invasion, including in March of that year, the Pentagon generated a document that was entitled, quote, Foreign Suitors for Iraqi Oil Field Contracts. It included a map of areas that could be explored. We were already carving up Iraq's oil fields months and months before 9/11 and almost 2 years before the eventual invasion. So now we've got all sorts of other false stories, the aluminum tube story, which was April of that year. Now, we also know, by the way, that President Bush got a daily briefing in August entitled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the U.S. and did nothing about it. But he managed to turn other people's adversity to his own benefit by exploiting 9/11 to conduct the war he'd been preparing for all along. The first major air raid on Iraq, by the way, took place in August before 9/11. Now, in August also, September, Curveball was granted asylum in Germany and stopped cooperating. MI6, the British spy agency, told the CIA that, quote, elements of his behavior strike us as typical of fabricators. Now, Curveball, the fabricator, would play a role in a war that never should have happened. Now, the totally discredited Ahmed Chalabi met with Defense Department officials on September 18th, a week after the 9/11 attack. People by that time were clear that we would be going into Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda, although there were some strange decisions made not to allow others to strike when they could have against al-Qaeda. Now, the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, which was stacked with a lot of the same Project for a New American Century people, decided the next day that Iraq should be invaded after we invaded Afghanistan. Now, the PNAC group wrote a letter to President Bush the day after that saying, and I quote, even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attack, any strategy aimed at the elimination or eradication of terrorism and its sponsors must include a determined effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Now, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, there's no question about it, but there is no evidence connecting him to terror. So what they were really saying was the public's appetite to protect itself from terror and strike back at those who hurt us should be exploited for our agenda. That's cynical reading between the lines. And of course, this was an opportunity to commit a whole other category of crimes by violating the United States Constitution. The day after that, now we're now up to September 21, John Yoo, a lawyer for the Justice Department, basically decided that the Fourth Amendment was moot. He wrote, quote, "The government may be justified in taking measures which in less troubled conditions could be seen as infringements of individual liberties." Now, those individual liberties had survived a civil war and 2 world wars, as well as a Cold War, but somehow they managed to describe the conditions after 9/11 as so exceptional that our Constitution no longer had any value. You also created what he called the doctrine of preemption, writing that Bush can act against anyone, a group, an individual, quote, even if it was, or I should say, even if it would be, quote, difficult to establish that they have been or may be implicated in attacks. In other words, even if you don't have anything to do with terrorism, we can go after you without respecting the Constitution or the rule of law. To make sure that they got the answer they wanted, Donald Rumsfeld, another war criminal, set up his own intelligence unit to look for Iraqi links to terrorism that didn't exist. That was in October of 2001. Then began the illegal renderings, kidnappings of people and rendering them to other countries, and our Constitution was on the downswing. Look, the entire year of 2002 was marked by orange terror alerts and red and this color coding designed to instill fear in the American people. There was lie after lie after lie. Condoleezza Rice said we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. There was a New York Times story, Judith Miller relying heavily on Curveball, who we've met before. There was Dick Cheney telling Rush Limbaugh Hussein is reconstituting his biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons programs when there was no such intelligence. Donald Rumsfeld saying in September the president hasn't made a decision to do anything with respect to Iraq. Now, bear in mind that more than a year and a half earlier, on his first national security meeting, he had already made that decision. They did not want to let the inspectors complete their work. Britain created a phony dossier saying Iraq could launch biological or chemical attacks within 45 minutes. Going on and on. Bush said in the Rose Garden, the Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons. None were found. He also said Rumsfeld said the link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda was, quote, accurate and not debatable, unquote. George Bush told the nation the Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons, is rebuilding the facilities to make more. The lies went on and on and on. The Iraqi Weapons of Mass Destruction Programs was the title of a phony document produced by George Tenet. And sure enough, by March 20th, we were at war with Iraq, a cynical war built on lies.